I think that should be good. So again, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar with Dr. Arbella Bet-Shlimon. My name is Alexandra Lazar, and I'm the Executive Director of the Assyrian Studies Association. Before we begin, I just wanted to mention that a recording of this webinar will be made available on both our website and our YouTube page. So please keep a lookout for a future email from us to access that recording. I also want to briefly introduce you to the Assyrian Studies Association, what we do, and how you can get involved. So Assyrian Studies Association is a nonprofit organization that promotes the academic study of Assyrian heritage through supporting research, teaching, and collaboration among scholars in various fields. We aim to highlight research on Assyrians by bringing them into dialogue with each other in order to illustrate a vibrant, robust, and authentic experience of Assyrian Mesopotamian heritage. We also build connections between academic institutions, as evident from the two symposiums we recently organized, one at Stanford University in 2023 and another at Arizona State University last year. We also build connections with scholars to strengthen the academic study of the Assyrian culture throughout North America and the world. Lastly, if you would like to get involved with ASA, we encourage you to register to receive our newsletters and emails that contain information about our upcoming events, including our 2027 symposium, grant opportunities, and much more by visiting our website at AssyrianStudiesAssociation.org. And now I'd like to introduce one of our board members, Dr. Mariam Bet-Younadam, who will be moderating this webinar. So Mariam is a faculty associate at Arizona State University's School of Politics and Global Studies. Previously, she was a presidential postdoctoral fellow in the School of Government and Public Policy at University of Arizona. Mariam's research explores issues of human rights, including local ethnic minority representation, marginalization, and mobilization. She conducted multiple rounds of fieldwork research in northern Iraq and compiled the first data set of protests by Assyrians in Iraq since 2005. Mariam, welcome. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra, for getting us started, for that introduction, and for introducing us to the Assyrian Studies Association. It is my honor to introduce today's webinar, which asks, how did the story of Assyrians, indigenous to and an intrinsic part of the fabric of the so-called Middle East, begin to disappear in dominant academic narratives? To address this question, we are joined by two brilliant scholars, Dr. Arbella Bet-Shlimon and Dr. Mariam Georgis, who discuss the challenges and urgency in critiquing dominant modes of scholarly inquiry about Assyrians in light of the recent publication of Dr. Bet-Shlimon's article, Propaganda of the Victims, Atrocity Denial, Ethnic Nationalism, and the Disparagement of Assyrians in Middle East Studies, which is published in the Review of Middle East Studies this year. A link to this article will be shared in the chat before we begin. Dr. Arbella Bet-Shlimon is the Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Washington, Seattle. A historian of Iraq and the Persian Gulf in the 20th century, she researches how people mobilize through emerging concepts of identity and how those types of individual and communal fashioning develop in relation to empire, colonialism, state-making, and transformations in infrastructure and the environment. She is the author of The City of Black Gold, Oil, Ethnicity, and the Making of Modern Kirkuk, published by Stanford University Press in 2019. Her work has also appeared in journals and magazines, including the Review of Middle East Studies, Journal of Urban History, Jadaliyya, Middle East Report, and Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Dr. Mariam Georgis is an assistant professor of global indigeneity in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. Grounded in embodied decolonial feminist epistemologies, her scholarship is located at the nexus of global politics, critical indigenous studies, and Middle East studies. Her publications on inserting Assyrians in global indigenous studies have appeared in Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, and Millennium, and Journal of International Studies. She is also a member of the board of directors of the Assyrian Studies Association. Please welcome Dr. Arbella Bet-Shlimon and Mariam and Dr. Mariam Georgis. Thank you both for joining us today. And Dr. Mariam, I will pass it on to you now to begin your conversation.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you, Naren. Thank you to all of our wonderful attendees for joining us for this conversation today. I'm really excited to be having a conversation with Arbella today. So I'm calling in today from Simon Fraser University in what is now British Columbia, Canada, which is located on the unceded and ancestral homeland of West Coast Salish nations. In having a conversation about marginalized, erased, and even maligned histories of Assyrians, it is important to note that these experiences we have are shared by Indigenous and oppressed and minoritized peoples all around the world. All the lands we live on, wherever we may be, have a history before colonization, before occupation, before settlement, and states. However, that looks in different contexts. First, I want to thank you, Arbella, for writing this paper. I've read it twice now, and it's really such an important intervention into the literature that continues to deny Semil, but also genocide in general. Can you, just so that we're all on the same page, give us a sort of brief summary or kind of major points you want to highlight of the article?
Yes, thank you, Mariam. Thank you to Nahre and Alexandra for these introductions as well. It's a privilege to be speaking to all of you today, and I think this is my first chance to actually be in dialogue with anyone about this article, including the attendees in this webinar, since it was published sort of out of the conference season in April, and I haven't had a chance to speak to people about it yet. So I'm really looking forward to this, but I do assume that, with the number of attendees we have here, people might be interested in the topic, but maybe haven't read it yet. So hopefully I can, get you up to speed on some of the basic points in this article. I should also start by acknowledging that, like Mariam, I am on the campus of, in my case, the University of Washington, that is on the Coast Salish lands and waters. And we are both on Coast Salish territory, even though we are separated by a colonial border between the United States and Canada, but we're actually pretty close to each other. So this article, which was published in April actually coincidentally just before the Genocide Remembrance Day of April 24th, it was published just a couple days before that, in Review of Middle East Studies. It recognizes broadly that atrocity denial, including genocide denial, but we might use that term more broadly of atrocity denial, is so central to Middle Eastern studies that some of the assumptions of that way of thinking are prevalent even among people who are not deniers. So 50 years ago, it was very common in the Middle East studies field for historians of the Ottoman Empire to deny the Armenian genocide and Saipho. That's much less common today. That way of thinking is considered very marginal. But scholars who, if you ask them what happened in 1915, was that a genocide? They say, oh, of course, I'm not a denier. But they will continue to repeat some of the tropes of genocide denial in their work. And this affects Assyrians in particular. Assyrians, more so than almost any other group in Middle Eastern studies, are subjected still today in newly emerging scholarship, not in stuff from 50 years ago, to racist standards and routine disparagement. And this even affects our interpersonal interactions with professors in the field. It's not just something, in other words, that appears in writing. And this disparagement of Assyrians based on racist assumptions is often undertaken on the pretense of being anti-colonial. The assumption being that Assyrians are like colonizers, or that they're contiguous with the views of colonizers, and that therefore they should be sort of slapped down or kind of like put in their place. This is a kind of prevalent attitude in the field. And part of my method in this article was to trace the process of publication of the article, The Assyrian Affair of 1933, by Khaldun Sati al-Hosri, that was published in our field's most prestigious journal, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, in 1974. This article is often the only source, or one of only two sources, about Assyrians cited in any book about Iraq by non-specialists in Iraqi history. It's the go-to, right? So you're a non-specialist writing your history of Iraq, you're mentioning Assyrians, you need your citation. That's Hosri, that article from 1974, more than half a century later, is the go-to still.
And yet there are very serious flaws with it, as well as flaws in the way it was published. But as I show, its very patently obvious problems actually get repeated uncritically in the literature over and over and over again, even in new publications. So that is what my article says in a nutshell.
Thank you, Arbella. That was great. Um, so maybe we'll just start off. Can you share a little bit about your experiences of being a Syrian in the academy or in your particular discipline, however you want to approach that?
Yeah, so I started working in the Middle East studies field after my undergraduate education, which was in a different area. I did a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan and a PhD in joint history and Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. And my own research specialty has always been in subjects that are not directly centered in Assyrian studies. So, I have a couple forthcoming publications coming out later this year. One is looks at the idea of revolutionary possibility in Iraq around 1958, 1959. Another one is a co-authored chapter about the history of oil in the Cold War in the Middle East. So that's more typical of my work, where Assyrians do come up, but they're not necessarily the central topic. But being Assyrian is the reason why I ask these research questions. It's the reason why I do what I do academically. It informs everything that I do, both in terms of research and in my teaching, right? Being from a group that has been historically marginalized, affects the ways that I teach and the kinds of sources that I want to give my students to read and the kinds of stories I want to highlight in my classes as well as in my research. So even though I'm not a quote unquote Assyrian studies scholar, and this article is actually the first thing in Assyrian studies that I've ever published, being Assyrian is so central to my positionality as a scholar. Personally speaking, I think it's relevant to talk about my personal background because I was born in the United States. So I am an Assyrian, but very much an Assyrian in diaspora. My mother is from Iraq. My father is from Syria. They're both on the call. Hello, mom and dad. My father is from Qamishli. My mother was born in Kirkuk, but raised mostly in Baghdad. And so then they met in the United States, and I was born here in what we now call the United States, right? So my positionality is one of an American, a person born in the US, and yet being Assyrian is so central to what I do, and I'm so conscious of my family's history, right? I think of it all the time in my work, and it informs, my choices of research topics. I wrote a book about Kirkuk because my mother's family is from there, right? So that is ultimately what gets me to think about the things that I'm interested in. And I know this is true for you too, Mariam, and you've had so many experiences in the field that are similar to the ones that led me to read this article that I was hoping you could give a similar background, summary of your background and your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I was born in what's today called Iraq. So my dad is from Inishke, so that's in the Sapna Valley of northern Iraq. My mother's from Mosul. I was born in Baghdad, and then as a child displaced to Turtle Island, what is now Canada. I actually spent, before coming to BC, I had lived mostly in Ontario, the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga Anishinaabeg people for a very long time before relocating here. My training is in political science. So my bachelor, master's, and PhDs in political science. I studied global politics and comparative politics of the global South, so Asia, Africa, Latin America. And in political science, being a Syrian is basically being invisible, right? So, but just like everything you just outlined now, being a Syrian shapes how I look at the world, what politics or frameworks make sense to me to understand the world, what questions I think are important to ask. And so when your story is marked by silence or absence, loss, you pay extra attention to those things. So I feel like so much of my writing starts with responding to those gaps in the literature that miss us entirely before I could even focus on writing what I want to write. For example, I had a chapter come out in 2017 about how nation building has operated in modern Iraq. And that really came out of just me being really mad at Iraqi studies. So there was no mention of Assyrians unless they were Assyrians in ancient times or as modern day Christian Arabs, right? And this is repeated across Middle East studies. It's not just Iraqi studies, right? Um, and if Iraqi studies does mention Assyrian heritage, it does it without even mentioning Assyrians at all, right? So ancient Iraq, this like kind of you know, um, this invocation of this land being ancient, but without the people, right? And so then you kind of just then collapse everybody to being Iraqi, right? Which is what statehood is all about, right? And so I want to be clear here, we're not exceptional. The Assyrian exception is not exceptional. All of my work in looking at global indigeneity and how states have been built in the modern world has really driven this home for me. Empire, colonization, occupation, genocide, all of these experiences are shared across the world. And it's really important that we think about these interconnected experiences in comparison. So liberation is not a solo endeavor. So thinking comparatively or thinking about these things collectively, then we can build solidarity and relationships with others whose experiences intertwine with ours. And so when we want recognition or reparation for our genocides, we have to really make sure that we understand the importance of naming other genocides and opposing genocide denial wherever we see it, right? So for example, something that has really been kind of the biggest thing on the news lately is for more than 2 years now, we've been watching the live stream genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, right? And we saw the denial of what we were seeing with our own eyes by governments and world leaders and even institutions. And a world where that happens is the same world that denies our genocides, right? And so that's really important to think about.
Yeah. I mean, as an Assyrian, I've always thought of the disparaging way that Assyrians are treated in the academy as directly analogous to the way that Palestinians are treated, right? It's so pervasive. And I would say that in Middle Eastern studies, like just specifically in that field, that has changed in recent years. But which is to say that Palestinians are not treated the way they used to be in Middle Eastern studies. But go back like 40, 50 years ago, they were absolutely being treated the same way as Assyrians. They would call themselves Palestinian and they would be corrected. Like, no, that's not a real thing. You're an Israeli Arab or something like that.
Yeah.
And I've had this experience, one of the things that set me down the path to writing this article was this repeated experience of just describing myself as an Assyrian in passing, which I do because it's part of who I am. Sometimes people see my name and they don't know what it is. They want to know what are you? Sometimes it's relevant, as I said, to the research questions I ask. So I'll just bring it up. As a grad student, I would bring it up to professors or I bring it up at a conference. And in interpersonal interactions with academics, they will actually react with mockery and scorn, right? You say the word Assyrian and they go, "Ugh, Assyrian,"
Yeah.
right? They'll actually like start mocking you. And I was so taken aback by it. They would also tacitly correct you. So you'd say, "I'm Assyrian." They go, "Oh, you're a Nestorian." And I had never heard the word, my family is from the Church of the East. I had never heard the word Nestorian in my life until I was 19. And it was such a bizarre, repeated interaction to have that happen over and over again. And then to encounter an academic article in which a senior academic bragged in the article, in his introduction to the article. This is an article by Adam Becker that I cite in my article, that he did this to an Assyrian. He was like, "Oh, I met this Assyrian, and then I put him in his place." And the Assyrian in question was Sargon Donabed, who was a grad student at the time. It's a pattern, by the way, that senior professors will do this to grad students. I got it all the time as a grad student. And I was just baffled by the complete normalization of this behavior in the field, which, as I said, at one time was done to Palestinians as well, and is still done to them in some contexts. So I've always seen to, our situation as analogous to that. And I think that one of the things that drove me to write this is because the Assyrian case illustrates the bigger problem of atrocity denial in our academic fields. It is such a pervasive problem, and it affects everyone, not just us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think what you're saying about, being a Syrian in the field is really, I'm laughing because it's something that we all experience, right?
Hmm.
First, I find that whenever someone asks, "What are you?" I'm already stumped. Like, what do I say? Do I say what country I'm from? Do I say what nation I belong to? Do I say who I am, right? And so then you find yourself becoming a historian because you want people to know what Assyrian is. So I encountered in political science people who just didn't know what Assyrian is, right? At all. They weren't like they weren't they weren't necessarily mocking. That actually comes mostly with my writing. So whenever any article I've published on Assyrians, undoubtedly one or all the reviewers will come back and ask, who are Assyrians? Because you're just Iraqis or you're just Arabs. How are you indigenous? Because indigenous peoples don't exist there, right? Um, and so you just get this kind of where you're always having to justify who you are before you even begin, where you're always having to explain how am I who I am. And that part is kind of really frustrating, right? Because I it's it's one thing to have academics do that, but or to walk through the world where you're constantly having to explain who you are or justify who you are. But then to also have to do it constantly in your writing at conferences amongst colleagues, and then it's super frustrating, right? And then also makes publication a very frustrating process and a much longer process, right? Because sometimes I would get reviews for articles where they're not even talking about the argument I'm making. They're still stuck on the who are Assyrians bit, right? Or they'll miss the point of my article and say, well, I remember one time I met someone who was like a big deal in Iraqi studies, and he kept talking about power sharing or something like that in Iraq. And I said, you've talked about everyone, but you haven't talked about Assyrians. And so I just want to note that like absence, right? And he was like, well, Assyrians kind of do it to themselves. They're all confused about who they are. And so, right? And so
Hmm.
this problem comes up over and over again where I'm having to explain, actually, I'm not taking up that debate. That's irrelevant to what the work I'm doing here. I'm trying to talk about something else, right? And so then you they you've become sidetracked before you even begin, right? So
Hmm.
um can you tell me a little bit about your experience doing the research for this article? So, if there were any insights you gained about your field in general, or just the publication process or anything like that?
Yeah, so I was eh, having noticed the problem, right? So the problem was overt and evident in my life and in my working conditions, right? Even as someone who wasn't in Assyrian studies, I was just constantly getting challenged for being Assyrian and identifying that way. And I realized a few things. One was that every Assyrian gets treated this way in academia. Virtually every person, including probably many people on this call, could probably tell several anecdotes about a college professor they encountered or somebody they spoke to who spoke to them this way. It's very, very common. But I realized that this phenomenon is hard to document. It's not something that has been really documented publicly and discussed. And in fact, the sole written documentation of it that I could find, other than in, let's say, social media posts or blog posts, was Adam Becker in his peer-reviewed publication bragging that he had done this to someone, right? And that was an interesting starting point for me. So I realized that this is hard to document, it's hard to write. I'm in a unique position as someone who has tenure to write about this. And for those of you not familiar with, academic jargon or academic norms, most people working in academia are precarious and don't have a lot of stability in their jobs. A minority of us are lucky enough, and Mariam and I are both in this category, to land positions that put you on what's called the tenure track, where you go through a probationary period and then if you pass review, you're promoted to a position that then it's very hard to fire you. It's not impossible, but very difficult. Particularly in the United States and Canada, the tenure system is more stable than it is just about anywhere else. So there are equivalents to this in the UK and Australia and many other countries, but they're not quite as stable as they are in North America, and I should say Anglophone North America. So this is the type of position that I have. I am tenured. I received tenure in 2019. And people who are in more precarious academic positions or are on the tenure track but haven't been promoted yet often want to avoid saying anything controversial or offending anybody. They don't want to critique anyone, right? And so I thought, well, I kind of felt this responsibility to say something about it. And also as a historian, I was in some ways seeing the worst of it. Because when there's problems in political science too, of course, that Mariam can speak to in a moment. But in the historiography on Iraq and in the broader historical literature on the Middle East, you see these tropes about Assyrians repeated over and over again. About 10 years ago, I started keeping a Google Doc where I just kept examples in there of like page this of this book and page this of that book and sort of direct quotations, because there were so many examples of repetitions of these racist ideas about Assyrians that were often not just flawed or biased, but actually inaccurate, right? Things that were just straight up wrong. And the standard for writing about Assyrians was so shoddy, right? It was like people who truly didn't know what they were talking about, and I discussed this in the article, published these works that are still cited as standard work in the field as though they are more credible than Assyrian historians. And I found this exasperating. So I realized the only way to do it would be to write my own article, right? That like writing a letter of complaint to IJMIS, IJMIS is the International Journal of Middle East Studies. I'm going to call it IJMIS. Or like writing a letter to the editor or writing an email to Mesa being, why did you let this paper through at the Mesa conference or something, was not going to get anywhere. And I realized that it was going to take like research and publication to really get through and make the points that I wanted to make. What I found, though, to get to Mariam's question about the research process, I quickly realized that an article that was just like 30 pages of examples, example number 1 of how Assyrians are discussed, example number 2, example number 3, just like repeating the same tropes over and over again, was not going to be a good article. That's not, a good research article. It's not going to pass peer review, and nobody's going to want to read it. And I realized that I had to have another angle, and I decided that given the pervasiveness of Khaldun Hosri's article, that I wanted to understand how that article came to be published, given that it was so transparently problematic, shoddy, self-contradictory. I wanted to understand how was this published in the most prestigious journal in the field in 1974. I open up the issue, which I had never done before. In this era of digital access of articles, we go to JSTOR or something and we download the article. You forget that once upon a time it appeared in a bound print volume, right? So I found the editorial note that preceded the article and realized the editor's intention for the article was to promote, the editor was Stanford Shaw, a famous/infamous historian of the Ottoman Empire. That his intent was to use this article by Khaldun Hosri to introduce his argument denying the Armenian genocide and Saipho that he would then develop in his 1977 book co-authored with his wife on the Ottoman Empire. So like his publication of Hosri's article was actually a preview of his much more infamous work on the Armenian genocide. These two things were directly linked to each other. I realized that very quickly. And then I thought, okay, I need to know more about IJMIS's editorial process in the 1970s. How did this even get published? What did it go under peer review? Who read it? Who edited it? So this involved a couple things. One was I pretty quickly figured out that the research that went into this article must have been based on Khaldun Hosri's PhD dissertation at the American University of Beirut. I was very lucky to know somebody with an AUB affiliation who downloaded the original dissertation for me and emailed it to me. And I read the relevant chapter line by line with the IJMIS article, and they are almost identical. And this is not how things usually work in academic publication. Today, virtually nobody would take an unedited dissertation chapter and publish it in the most prestigious journal in the field. That's not a thing. So something was off here. Clearly something about this publication process was not the way that we do things today, and yet this article had the like imprimatur of the most prestigious journal in the field, and that's why it kept getting cited. And so then the next thing that I wanted to do was to try to figure out what were IJMIS's editorial processes like in the 1970s. Stanford Shaw himself is long deceased, but other people who knew how IJMIS worked back then are still alive, or at least were still alive about 5 years ago when I started digging into this. And I sent emails to many people in that generation of scholars. I actually looked through IJMIS in the 70s, saw who had published. Some of them were people I knew from grad school, like my own grad school professors who are retired. And I sent them emails and said, hey, can you tell me something about what it took to get published in IJMIS in the 1970s? Was there a blind peer review process? What were your interactions with Stanford Shaw like? And I either got no reply, even from people who, one of the people I emailed is someone who knows me from grad school, typically replies in 20 minutes, never replied. Or I got rebukes in a couple of cases, people who wrote back and basically said they weren't going to help me. And what I realized is that, here I was naively thinking, oh, these people are all retired, right? Like they're not vulnerable assistant professors who don't want to be critical, trying to protect something. They're not, currently working academics applying for a grant, so they're afraid of offending the reviewer. These are like people in their 80s, they're retired. I thought for sure, they'll reply and be candid with me. And almost all of them just refused, right, to help. And I realized that academics don't want to be critical of one another, even when they have nothing to lose. It's just part of the culture of academia that even if in some cases, some of these people were broadly politically sympathetic to what I wanted to do, but they didn't want to help. They're very defensive, right? There was one exception, and that exception is a person who I do quote in my article, and that was Donald Reed, who is completely outside of the field of Iraqi history or Assyrian studies, has nothing to do with it. He's primarily a historian of Egypt who taught for many years at Georgia State University. He's long retired now. And he happened to publish an article about Syrian Christian Arab nationalists in the same issue as Husri. It's the article that appears right after Husri's article. He was the only person willing to talk to me. And we got on Zoom, we had a conversation in 2022, and he had no idea that Stanford Shaw had put these two articles back to back because he didn't own a copy of the issue. He knew his article had been published in 1974, but didn't own a copy of the issue. He had no idea that Shaw had used the two articles back to back to make his genocide denial case. And I'm, simplifying Shaw's words here, but it was essentially a kind of good Christian versus bad Christian dichotomy, right? So the Assyrians are the bad Christians. The exact quotation is in my article. You can look it up. But the Assyrians are the bad Christians. And then in contrast, let's read Donald Reed's article about the good Christians, the ones who were Arab nationalists, right? And that's the good version. Donald Reed, when I read that out loud to him, that editorial note, he reacted with shock. And he said, well, that's a pretty loaded interpretation of my work. And I asked him for permission to quote him on that, and it's in the article. And he told me that he had sent the article to IJMIS in 1970. It was accepted for publication at the time, but Shaw held it until 1974 and then published it back to back with Husri. So today, after all these years, Husri's gone, Shaw's gone, like we don't have, at least I, despite extensive searching, was not able to find records of exactly what happened there. And we have no way, of course, of reconstructing Stanford Shaw's reasoning. He's long dead. But it's pretty clear that there was some intention here in how he put these articles together. And that really unlocked the whole issue for me and ended up being a key point in the article. But it was a real challenge to even figure out what to put in this article and what to leave out, right? I had to actually leave out a lot of examples of how Assyrians are discussed in historiography because it just would have made the article really repetitive. It just would have been like 30 pages of examples. And I actually had to make the point of how and why this is happening. So in a lot of cases, the examples of racist treatment of Assyrians just appear in like a page number citation and a footnote, but I don't actually quote it in the article because there just isn't room. And it also wouldn't make for an interesting article. So it's just saying like, here's how pervasive this issue is in literature, but now let's try to dig into the issue of why and how this happened and what the origin is of some of these discourses. So that gets you a little bit into the research process and the challenges of doing it. One of the articles that I cite very centrally in my article, Mariam, is your 2017 article that you just mentioned. I was hoping you could talk a bit about the challenges of that too, because I would never, I want to start by saying I would never have been able to write this critique without the previous work of other Assyrian scholars. So in other words, Mariam's own work, of course, also in this article, I cite a previous critique of Hosri's article by Sargon Donabed that was published in Idjmis in 2022, but it's much shorter. I know that the editor there imposed really serious limitations on him, so it's a much shorter critique. And other, the work of many other people who I'm afraid of even naming names I'm going to forget. I know Elda Benjamin's work has been so central in how I wrote this article, and so many other people who appear in the footnotes of my article. So like I couldn't have written this without you guys. And your 2017 article was very helpful to me when I was writing this. So I was hoping you could talk about the challenges there too.
Thank you. I actually really love how you went on some kind of like quest to figure out how this Hosri article even was published in Idjmis. I love that. I think it's so important because what you're really describing is this kind of larger thing that we need to understand about knowledge production in general, right? We live in a colonial world. Knowledge production is part of that world. It's not outside of it, right? And so all of these Iraqi studies scholars, these Middle East studies scholars, hell, even American and Canadian studies scholars in politics, they are invested in a field, right? They build their careers in a field and they are invested in these fields. And all of these fields are sustained by promoting a worldview, by the absences and the silences that actually make producing that worldview even possible. The only way Iraqi studies could produce this narrative that Iraq is post-colonial state that gained its independence from the British and that it is an Arab state with a Kurdish problem is because it has rewritten history, right? And it has, and that's political, right? Choosing where we start the history, what we count as history is also political, right? So for me in that chapter, that's kind of what I was trying to get at. How did we get to think about Iraq as an Arab state with a Kurdish problem? Where's everybody else, right? And so for me, it started by thinking about how the entire region of Southwest Asia is the only colonialism that we count in that region is European.
Mm-hmm.
But the history of empire is long, and the history of history is long, and it predates European colonization, certainly for ancient peoples like us, right? And so that's one thing that I was trying to do in that piece is to think about how can we think about colonialism as global if we only count this as colonization? Because that's the only way you can have this narrative about Iraq as a post-colonial state. It's not a post-colonial state as long as it's occupying Assyrian land, as long as it occupies other people's lands who live there, right? And so it's really important for us to think about when we tell this predominant story of Iraq, whose story are we erasing, right? Whose story are we maligning? The only way you can think of Assyrians as these especially in the Semil massacre, as these people who deserved to be killed because they were threatening this newly established Arab Iraqi state, and they were divisive, and the cohesion of the Iraqi state depended on getting rid of these Assyrians who refused to be Arab. The only way you could have that story is if you erase the other history of Bet-Nahran, right? This land between two rivers. That's the only way you could have that. And that's still not the only place we see that, right? Oftentimes, indigenous peoples around the world, when they fight for their right to be called what they are, when they fight for their land, when they resist occupation, they are seen as troublemakers. They are seen as divisive. And so that's something that we have to notice, right? This is what I was talking about before, about how we have to think about how do we have to think comparatively, right? This nation building process in Iraq is not singular. It didn't just happen in Iraq. It happens everywhere. That's how states function, right? They have to make a homogenous thing. And it's not just about Semel. It's reoccurring today. The Kurdistan region of Iraq is trying to build a quasi-ethno-nationalist state, but we see what ethno-national states do. At the very worst of them, they are genocidal because they have to remove everyone who doesn't belong to that majority, right? Statehood in itself is problematic. And so for me, it was really important to, not just in that article, but every article that came after, is to really kind of undo what knowledge production in general has instilled in us to do, which is only tell this whatever story that we need to tell in order to sustain that one worldview, right?
Mhm.
I do have one more question to ask you before we head into the question period. Um, can you share with us kind of the publishing process or the reviews or just kind of your experience in trying to get this paper out into the world?
Yeah, thank you, Mariam. I also want to kind of reinforce everything you were just saying, and that your framings in your work were really helpful to me in writing this. And it's so important to be able to think about concepts like colonialism, indigeneity, and the state, and different minoritized or subaltern groups' relations with the state. To think about these things as capaciously as possible. So the only form of oppression, in other words, not just like Europeans in a certain place. But you can have like overlapping indigeneities or like a conflict between groups that are themselves oppressed by other people, right? It's not always a binary. To use the Kurdistan regional government example, of course, Kurds are historically oppressed, right? Um, so,
Absolutely.
so you have to be able to think in this like complex way and capacious way about these concepts. And so often what we're encountering in our academic fields is dismissal, that if you don't fit my kind of narrow view of what this word means, that we're just gonna dismiss you as some kind of nationalist or bigot, right? And if you don't fit my narrow-minded pre-existing worldviews, I'm going to refuse to engage with your work. Is so often the attitude that as Assyrians we encounter, and it's so important in part because the field of genocide studies now is completely consumed by a crisis because of the genocide in Palestine and systematic denial of it, between people who want to exceptionalize certain experiences of oppression and people who want to see oppressions as interconnected. And my view here is that your two options are to analyze genocides comparatively or to engage in denial. There is no third.
Yeah,
If you are not
absolutely.
thinking comparatively, you are a denier, and you need to face that, and you need to think about what that means for yourself and how that forces you to modify, I hope, your ways of analyzing these problems. So to get to the question about like the process of publication, even figuring out how to structure and pitch the article, like who's my audience, who am I writing for, was tough because it created a kind of chicken and egg problem as far as which journal am I going to submit it to and what's their audience. Do I write it for that audience? Is that journal even going to accept it? Or if I write it for a certain audience and then send it to this journal, is that going to take the article in a direction that I don't want? It was actually really hard for me to figure out exactly where to pitch this. And the first place I pitched it, desk rejected. It was a non-Middle East Studies journal. Desk rejection means that the editor consulted his editorial board and then came back to me and said, nope, we don't even want to see the article. In other words, they didn't send it out for review. On the grounds that this is not of interest to a broader readership. This is of interest to Middle Eastern studies only, so you should send it to a Middle East Studies journal. And I had hoped it was of interest to a broader readership, but I went ahead and sent it to a Middle East Studies journal, Review of Middle East Studies. And in telling my experience with Review of Middle East Studies, I want to start with a little caveat, which is that the journal and the editor of the journal were ultimately supportive of this article. I did not get a desk rejection. They sent it out for review, chose the editor, chose the reviewers carefully. The editor, The editor chose reviewers carefully who were then supportive of the article. The editor then gave me good editorial comments that helped me actually restructure the whole article to make it stronger. So I want to emphasize that ultimately the experience was positive. The article did get published. And so when I mount some of these critiques that I'm about to say, I don't want anyone to look up the editor of Review of Middle East Studies and then like send her hate mail or something. Please don't do that, because she's not the villain here. Like ultimately she did publish the article, and I'm grateful to her for her help because her comments on it actually helped me improve it. But so I sent it to Review of Middle East Studies last March of 2025. And it took me 6 months to get reviews back. So the editor did send it out to 2 reviewers, which is that journal's practice. Some journals have more reviewers, some try to do fewer, but this was 2 blind peer reviewers. And the way this works is that my name was not on the text that went to those reviewers, and those reviewers were not known to me. So that's what blind peer review, that's usually how that works. The comments came back and they were very positive and supportive. Both reviewers had some critiques, right? And I took those into account as I improved and edited the article. But both were very supportive and basically said this should be published. And the editor was a little more critical of the article and categorized it as a revise and resubmit. In other words, requiring more substantial rewriting, which I did in response to her comments. And it was clear that the editor, who is in the Middle East studies field, doesn't work in Iraqi studies, and this was something that was kind of outside of her area, was she was careful, let's say. She was being very, very, very careful, and wanted me to change certain things, remove certain things, disagreed with me on certain wordings. There was one that I fought to keep in. She thought that I was being unfair to Madawi al-Rashid by saying that she doesn't know what she's talking about. I made that comment in response to Madawi al-Rashid's admission in her own book about Assyrians that she did not know that Assyrians existed until she started researching the book. She thought that it was a word invented by diasporic Iraqis in London in 1990. So to admit something like that in your book, and so I was just like, this illustrates the extremely shoddy standard, and that book still gets cited, right, as like a work on Assyrians. And my editor thought, it's really normal actually for people to not understand a topic before they start researching it. She thought that my comment was a bit unfair, and I said, not on that level, right? We wouldn't accept that level of complete ignorance of the topic, really, for any other topic in Middle Eastern studies for a peer-reviewed work, right? This isn't like somebody's Substack, So anyway, I did fight to keep certain things in, and she let me do that. But then when the article it was on the verge of actually being published. It was in what's called the proofs phase, where you're not just dealing with a Word document, but it's actually been set in the PDF that it's going to look like when it's published. Typically, once you get to proofs, the editor does not want you to make very many changes because it changes the pagination of the issue, and it's can be expensive sometimes depending on how they're publishing it to make major changes. So at that point, really what they're asking you for in the proofs phase is just to change typos. If there's a missing comma or a misspelled word or little tiny things, to change that. At the proofs phase, the editor asked me to remove several sentences from the article. One was an anecdote about a time that a senior scholar had mocked Assyrians in front of me. And the editor asked me, did you get his permission to include this anecdote? I said, no, he's dead. This happened in 2008, and he died last year, I think. And she said, well, you can't include it then. So I didn't. And then another one was a reference to work that hasn't been published yet, but that I'm aware of because it has gone out for peer review. And in fact, Mariam, you were one of the people who told me about one of those works. Other scholars I won't name, because of the confidentiality expected in blind peer review, other scholars I won't name contacted me to say, I just got this book proposal, for a book about Assyrians that says all these terrible things, and do you know anything about it? So, in other words, there's work still coming up through the publication pipeline that's being sent to major university presses and prestigious journals that those editors, listen, any crank can write anything and send it to a journal, but usually it gets desk rejected, right? These editors think that these works merit being sent out for review. So, like, work about Assyrians that still repeats these racist tropes is being sent out for review now in 2025, 2026, right? So I had put a reference to that in the article, and what the editor said to me is you can't cite things that haven't been published yet based on a peer reviewer's impression of it, right? And I said, okay. So we did remove that. But what I love about it is because that happened so late in the process, which again is highly unusual. I've never had it happen before. Because it was removed at the proofs, if you go to the article and download the PDF, do a little forensic, I don't know, a little control F or something, do a little searching in that PDF and try to find places where there's a couple of sentences that are slightly too far apart. There's a gap. That's where they made me take the content out. And I'm really glad that those little gaps are there to show where that happened. So yeah, very, very unusual that I was asked to remove things at the end. And what I learned from that experience is if you're mounting a critique like this, do not play it safe. Do not think to yourself, oh, that's unfair. I shouldn't say that. Let me leave that out. No, put it in, put everything in, and let the editor make you take it out, right? Like do the
Yeah.
maximum
Yeah.
and let them bargain you
Yes.
down, right?
Yes.
So that was what I did, and it got published, and I'm really grateful to Review of Middle East Studies ultimately for being supportive. I'm grateful to the two peer reviewers for their support. And so far, we'll see what happens in this conversation in this webinar. Like I said, it's my first time really being in dialogue with people about it, but so far the feedback I've gotten has all been positive. I'm happy to hear critiques. We can talk about that, but yeah, so far both not just Assyrians but non-Assyrian scholars have emailed me after reading this saying, I had no idea about any of this, right? Thank you for writing this. I learned so much from this article. And that's good. That was sort of the goal was to illuminate a problem that I think so many people just don't know about and to put it in a high profile journal where people would read it. So yeah, and I couldn't have done it without the work of people like you, Mariam, and other Assyrian Studies scholars. I don't want to make it sound like I was the first person to do this, right? I couldn't have done it without the existing work that I built on. So thank you to every Assyrian scholar on this call who played a role.
Well, the same goes for me. I was definitely not the first person to write on Assyrians either. So yeah, definitely appreciate all the because it is a big problem, right? When you go to write on Assyrians, it's mostly non-Assyrians, and they are taken as more seriously than Assyrians, right? Because we're too nationalist, we're too biased, we're too all the words that these institutions like to use to silence us. But they'll take someone who doesn't know the community, doesn't know the language, doesn't know the history, and they will publish them, right? And all that means is, since there's work coming up in the pipeline, that me and you have our work cut out for us when it does come out, that we can actually say something about it, right? I don't want to say too much because I want to leave time for Q&A, so I will give the mic over back to Naharen to moderate our questions. But thank you so much. This was such a pleasure to sit down and talk with you about this, Arbella.
Yeah, thank you, Mariam.
Thank you both for this conversation. We are fortunate to have received multiple questions. And let's just start by saying we hope to have time to address as many questions as possible. And we just appreciate everyone who submitted a question and is sharing or expressing their interest in not only the article, but some of the topics that we've discussed. So we are going to try to get through as many questions as possible in the next 20 minutes or so. Let's start with one of the earlier questions. So I think this question can be a question that's directed to both Dr. Bet-Shlimon and Dr. Georgis, but how do you see these patterns of academic denialism echoing or perhaps differing from the way the field treats other stateless Indigenous groups in the region? So we'll start with that question.
Yeah, I mean, we've both alluded to the crisis in the field and in so many academic fields in just these past 3 years over how to discuss, Israel's campaign in the West Bank and Gaza in particular, and the apartheid system across the whole territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and in particular the genocide in Gaza. There's so many cases where a group of people is dismissed, disparaged, and as I would say as I said earlier, in Middle Eastern studies, I think that has changed toward Palestinians, but only because of Palestinian scholars fighting back for decades to get it to that point. And that talking about them in that disparaging way, let's say 40 years ago would have been, or even 30 years ago would have been much more common than it's been in, let's say, the past 20 years. Within the context of Iraqi studies, you'll get similar kind of dismissive, treatment of Yazidis, for example. Really, any group that is, historically oppressed and marginalized and kind of ignored, misunderstood, can be subjected to this type of treatment. There are aspects, I make the case in my article, there are aspects of how Assyrians are pathologized that are comparable to other groups, but somehow worse or more persistent. So I make the comparison with observations made by the Byzantine historian Mariam Georgis about how Greeks used to be discussed in the academic literature. So as late as the 1960s, classicists would do this the same kind of way that we get this, like, oh, you're Assyrian? Really? You're still using that word to describe yourself? You think you're descended from the ancient, empire? Greeks would get that kind of like, oh, really? You actually think you're descendants of the ancient Greeks? And they don't anymore, right? But what Mavroudi did was sort of documenting that older classics literature that's still in print and reissued. And what I pointed out is that this is still happening in new publications on Assyrians, always with sort of the pretense of being anti-colonial. In my article, I cite scholarship by the Egyptian historian Hussein Omar on Copts, where he goes through how they've been sometimes subjected to a similar narrative of somehow being like tools of imperial interests, and then critiques that and critiques the use of al-Assad's work to make that case. And I show how that's sort of directly applicable to the Assyrian case as well. So we can point to other cases, but I do think that there are certain unique features within Middle Eastern studies to how Assyrians are discussed. I know, Mariam, as a comparative Indigenous scholar, you might have other perspectives on this as well.
I want to echo everything you just said, but I'm going to kind of go in a bit of a different direction just so that we get two different answers. For me, I find, how do I say this? Like, I have to think about how do I say this? There are minoritization is not the same for everyone. That process is different, and how we are minoritized is different, and how we are received is different, right? So Kurds are called a minority in Iraq. And minoritization is relative, like minorities it's a relative number. They are a minority in relation to Arabs. They are not a minority in relation to the other very minoritized groups that they live amongst, right? Mm-hmm. And I've never been able to give a talk or write an article where I wasn't asked, you're talking about Assyrian liberation, what about the Kurds? Never, right? Anytime I've ever listened to a Kurdish speaker talk about Kurds, they've never been asked, what about so-and-so, right? They're taken at face value. They're engaged with by their own merit. But I've never had that luxury, right? And that also tells us something about knowledge production, right? That's not to say that, like you said, Kurds have been marginalized. Kurds have suffered genocides and ethnic cleansing and all those things. Yes, right? Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that we should not be able to talk about Kurdish settlement of Assyrian land, Kurdish occupation of Assyrian land grabs in the north and elsewhere, without having to do that caveat, right? Mm-hmm. We should be able to talk about Assyrians and be taken seriously into saying how the formation of the Iraqi state and how the formation or the continuous ongoing formation of the Kurdistan region has impacted Assyrians. Displacement, assimilation, ethnic cleansing, marginalization, political, economic, social. We should be able to do those things, but we can't right now the way and under the guise of being fair to everyone, right? Under the guise of, the Kurds are a liberatory movement that's radical and left wing and all that stuff. Okay, but I've never seen a liberation movement that coincided with statehood that wasn't in and of itself problematic and genocidal, right? So I'll just end there just for time.
Mhm.
Thank you both for your responses. I did see a raised hand in the during the webinar. So if there is a question that you have, please feel free to just submit your question in the Q&A so we can try to get it answered that way. We do have a number of attendees who are asking about, what can we do to change things? So, is there, organizations that can be formed? Is there a way to have a different access to knowledge? What is it that we can do to kind of correct this and be better and make a change so that the representation is reflected in academic literature? Like, what are some suggestions that you both have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that work is being done by Assyrian scholars, and I think Mariam can speak more to the specifics of it as someone who's working more directly in that area. So, in other words, this critique that I wrote became possible in part because I could cite the work of other Assyrian scholars. It would have been much harder for me to write this article when I started grad school 20 years ago. So having, so many people working in academia now has helped with that a lot. And it's just a matter of, I think from my perspective, without going into the specifics, just being willing to be critical, right? It can be scary. But I think people overestimate the extent to which they need to protect themselves. And I think that they fool themselves into thinking that they can depoliticize their work and stay quiet and they'll be safe. And that's just not true. Even as someone who doesn't work directly in the Assyrian studies field, my working conditions were affected by people disparaging me all the time for being Assyrian. And so I felt like I had to say something about it, and you have to be willing to do that. But yeah, I think Mariam can get into some of the specifics here.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything you just said, Arbella. And to add to it, yeah, I do think we need to understand that knowledge production is not apolitical. Nothing is, in fact. Me saying I'm Assyrian and refusing to be called a Christian Arab, a Christian Kurd, a minority, that is political. That is me doing political work. Me starting the story from before Iraq became Iraq is political, right? And so I think understanding how all of knowledge production is political work is really important in order to be critical. But I also think we need to center the voices of the people that we're talking about, right? That is a really big one. And I've kind of said this before. Part of this colonial knowledge production process is this idea of an academic that is neutral, that is objective. That's not a real thing. Those are all colonial made up things that have told a specific story about the world. And I think what we need to do now is if we want more kind of nuance this understanding of Iraq to reinsert Assyrians back into the story, so to speak, then you have to center Assyrian voices. You have to center Assyrian scholarship that is produced by Assyrians. That doesn't mean scholarship can't be produced by other people. That's not what I'm saying. But for a long time, Assyrians have been written about and talked about by non-Assyrians, and that has absolutely contributed to this disparagement, to this denial, to this marginalization that we're seeing today, right? And again, that's not only for Assyrians. We see that all across the world, right? And non-Assyrian scholars are seen as more legitimate than Assyrian scholars because they're neutral, and we're seen as nationalists. Even as I mount a critique against nationalism as being problematic and genocidal, If I say what I'm saying now, I'm still considered a nationalist. It's not about being a nationalist. It's about centering the voices of the people that you're talking about. No one understands Zionism better than Palestinians. No one understands the formation of statehood in Bet-Younadam across those 4 states better than Assyrians and other indigenous groups to that region, right? And that matters. And we have to say that. And if you are not Assyrian working on Assyrians, then you need to be citing Assyrians. You need to be talking to Assyrians, and you need to recognize your own limitations. All of our work has limitations, right? So we need to recognize that too.
Thank you both for those points. There is a question about the issue of credibility that we can share. So the issue of credibility is clearly key to your research. Could you comment on the challenges Assyrian scholars and experts may face when their expertise is questioned or their work is considered less objective because of their Assyrian identity? Have you or have others encountered this dynamic, and what strategies have you found effective in navigating it?
Absolutely. And this gets exactly to what Mariam was just saying about how the work of non-Assyrian scholars is privileged over the work of Assyrian scholars on the presumption that it's more neutral, which is nonsense, because there is no such thing as depoliticized or apolitical or neutral scholarship. And this is how you get something like Madawi al-Rashid, who is from Saudi Arabia, who didn't know Assyrians existed until 1990, writing a book about them and having her work still be cited as standard scholarship on Assyrians based on 20 interviews with Assyrian families in London in the 1990s. Yeah, so so it's a very real problem that Assyrian scholars themselves are seen as not as credible. And there isn't a, I think, single solution to that problem because it's so pervasive. Other groups face it too, and in particular, subaltern groups, people of color, historically colonized people, when they start writing about their own conditions, get treated like they're not writing as neutrally as, Mariam and you and I were just talking about this the other day, that like white Africanists are privileged over
Yes.
African scholars writing in African studies,
Yes.
for example. Yeah, so it's just such a pervasive academic problem. And it's one of the reasons why I was really hoping this article might get a broader readership beyond just Assyrians themselves, because this isn't just about us, right? Like these same problems exist in other fields too. But to the question of how we navigate it, it's really tough. And sometimes it just requires you, honestly, to be sort of stubborn and fight back, be willing to fight the editor, be willing to talk back to the professor when you're a grad student. And it's difficult. One reason, though, that I wrote this article and wanted it to go into a journal that was open access, that was very important to me. I didn't want it to be behind a paywall, is so that when the next graduate student, the person like I was in 2006, right, 20 years later, is at a conference and mentions to someone that they're Assyrian, and the reaction is, "Oh, you're Assyrian? Like from the Bible? Like you actually call yourself that? What does that mean? You're one of those like Iraqi Christians. That's what you are." The next time they get that reaction, I want them to go, "Well, actually, what you're doing is repeating a very common misconception. I've got an article for you to read." Send them the link, right? I want them to have that resource, and that was my hope in writing this. Yeah, Mariam, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm just gonna quickly say that I have 2 strategies for this. I've encountered this my entire time in academia, so it's absolutely a real thing. One is doubling down. Yeah, just doubling down. If someone tells me this isn't correct, I'm just going to have 10 footnotes to show you how it is correct, and then I'm going to publish that somewhere else. Right? And so doubling down is really important. You can't give up after the first death rejection, because most often than not, you have to understand that the rejection is not about your work. The rejection is political, right? When you're trying to destabilize fields that have basically built themselves on your erasure, that's not easy. They're going to fight back. And so you have to be willing to get into that fight, right? And so just doubling down for me. The second is actually connecting with, looking around, seeing who's experiencing the same things as me and connecting with them. I find that building connections with people who have experienced the same things we have through solidarity is really important. it's not just important in academia for me as an academic, but in general, in life, right? If we're truly trying to see a world where we are not absolutely, it's the world right now is unfathomable, basically. And so if we want to see a different world than that, then that is what is required. It is to actually think about how can I build something better with people who have similar experiences to me, because we all have a stake in this game. And so for me, that is a really big thing, building community, building solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, Assyrians have to show up for other groups.
That's right.
If we're just like, why aren't you paying attention to me? We're going to get dismissed as a bunch of sort of navel-gazing nationalists. And you know what? Not without reason. So we
100%.
have to show up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think this will probably be our last question before we wrap up the webinar. This question is about the ignorance or, the denialism of Assyrians in academic literature. And you both have touched on this briefly, but maybe we can elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts here. Do you believe that this ignorance is primarily driven by a lack of knowledge, perhaps because Assyrians are still underrepresented in the academic world? Or do you think it's driven by a desire to marginalize Assyrians? And if so, what do you believe motivates this? So what's the motivation behind denialism? And then do you think attitude towards Assyrians within academic research will improve over time? I know in your article, Arbella, you mentioned, we have graduate students, postdocs, non-tenured professors, we have people out there. So what will the field look like, 5, 10 years from now? And what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, things are getting better even now. Like I said, if I had tried to write this article 20 years ago, it would have been a much bigger challenge. So I can mount this critique in part because so many Assyrians have, despite these obstacles, made their way into the academy. And so, yes, with more of us present, it's going to get better. But in a broader context in which higher ed in so many countries is in free fall, for all sorts of reasons, if you've kept up with the news in the United States about cuts in federal funding to universities and universities sort of shrinking their graduate programs, and Canada has somewhat different dynamics, the UK has somewhat different dynamics, but there's similar things happening everywhere. And so, there are more of us entering into academia, but in a state where academia itself is highly precarious. And a lot of those people won't be able to get very stable jobs. So that is the caveat. But yes, as more people enter academia, that will get better. The question of genocide denial is so difficult. I think one of the paradoxes of genocide is that we think of it as this crime of crimes, right? We think it is so overwhelmingly terrible that of course you can't do it with impunity. Of course those people will eventually be punished. And yet it is something that in our world is happening with impunity constantly. There has been no real restitution for the genocide of Assyrians either, more than 100 years later, right? It is still routinely denied. And I think so much of it comes back to, at least partly, to this academic cowardice. People don't want to speak out. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to critique each other. It requires a certain amount of, moral courage and a commitment to understanding the politics of knowledge production to, keep this in front of the agenda and make sure that we keep talking about it.
I'm just like nodding vigorously at everything you're saying, Arabella. I think for absolutely academia only changes when more of us enter the academy, but also people who understand also that they have to undo some of this politics of knowledge production too. It's not just about entering the academy. You can absolutely enter the academy and keep enacting the same kind of dynamic that is colonial, that is all of these things in academia, and then nothing would be changing. Okay? And so that really has to do with politics there. In terms of genocide denial, I honestly see it as it could be a lack of knowledge, right? Most Assyrians you meet, most people you meet don't know who Assyrians are, so it could be that, and that is a very generous interpretation. I also think it has absolutely a vested interest, right? The state of Iraq pretends that it is an Arab state because it has a vested interest right? And when Assyrians constantly demand that they are Assyrian, they are unraveling something that is always tense and always in the making, which is Iraq's statehood, right? And so that in of itself is threatening, right? And so Iraq as a state has a vested interest in telling these myths that it is an Arab country, right? We see this in the north today in the Kurdistan region of Iraq as well. We see actually this in all states all around the world, right? But we're talking about Assyrians, and so that's why I'm talking about Assyrians. In terms of academics, it's the same thing. We have a vested interest in maintaining these fields that we have dedicated our careers to and our lives to in some cases. And so we continue to do those things, right? Either to get published or to get tenured or to get ahead or to get whatever, because it's not easy to not do those things. So you absolutely need a moral compass. You need moral clarity. You need basically you need bravery, right? In order to continue to say that I'm going to do my small part in destabilizing or challenging something that has become so dominant that everybody sees it as natural, right?
Mhm.
Okay, thank you both. Arbella, we have several questions that we did not get answered, so we can definitely share it with our panelists today to try to get some of the responses back to our attendees. So we do apologize not being able to get to everyone's question during this Q&A session, but we do appreciate you submitting your questions definitely. I do think this is a wrap up of the webinar. Thank you both for this conversation and for your insight and just being these voices for Assyrians, in the homeland, in diaspora, in academic literature, outside of academic literature. It really shapes the information that we have out there, and hopefully that information shapes the future for Assyrians generally. And I think that's it.
Thank you all. Thank you for being in conversation. Thank you all for coming. And if you have specific questions that we didn't get to, our work email addresses are not that hard to find. And if you've got like a specific question about my article, you can email me.
Yes, thank you all so much for attending. Thank you, Arbella, for this wonderful conversation. If you did have questions for me that I did not see in the Q&A, absolutely feel free to email me at my work address. I will absolutely get back to you. And I definitely prioritize emails from fellow Assyrians. So drop me a line.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining our webinar. We hope to see you in the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.